past, Clinton County, Missouri was the western edge of the United States. Situated between two emerging cities, Kansas City and St. Joseph, Clinton County benefited from their growth. The Pony Express, the Gold Rush, and Western migration brought people through the county, but the population that settled here put it on the map. Plattsburg became the beef capital of the world. Lathrop was the major supplier of mules for the Boer Wars and World War I. 5 railroads crisscrossed the county, and the nation's first north-south highway ran through Cameron, Plattsburg, and Trimble on its way to Kansas City. Clinton County was home to David Rice Atchison, president for a day, James Harvey Birch, Missouri Supreme Court judge, Willis J. Wynn, president of the Cleveland Federal Reserve, and James Marshall, early leader of the Manhattan Project. Here are more family histories of Clinton County.
Hello there, my name is Edie Gengelbach Fessler, and I'm here with my brother and sisters to talk about our family history of when they came to Plattsburg and Clinton County, and they moved here in 1836, which makes them one of the first families in Clinton County. So with that, I will begin and start talking about our family history and some of the sketches. Before I begin, I would like to say that on the first thing that is showing there, I have listed the children of Morris Lee and Alice Rowland Gengelbach, and those are the children that we have collected all this information and presenting to you today. First person on the list is my sister Alice Maureen Bodenhausen Gengelbach, and my brother Roland Lee Gengelbach. My name is Edith Gengelbach Fessler, and my sister is Mary Lynn Gengelbach Evans, and she is not here today. In order to kind of let you know who we are, I collected an interesting picture of each one of us throughout the years. The first picture you see is my mother holding Maureen when she was probably about 1 year old. And that is my mother, Alice, and the picture date is 1936. Maureen's name is Alice Maureen. Her first name is Alice because that's what my mother's name was. And her second name, middle name, is Maureen, and her name was as close as my parents could get to Maurice, her father. The second child that Morris and Alice had was Roland, and his first name is Roland, which is my mother's maiden name. His middle name is Lee, and that is my father's middle name. And you'll see that Roland is sitting there holding treats up for the dog Queen. As we go through this presentation, you'll notice that there are several dogs that appear in the scene. The majority of the dogs that were at our house, and we always had dogs and multiple dogs at many times. Mostly the female dogs were named Queen, and the male dogs were King. So we'll see some more dogs along the way. The third child that was born to Alice and Roland and my Morris and Alice is myself, Edith Gale. My mother was an English major and music major in college, and she loved Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Children's Hour. And on that sheet that we're showing right now, I'll read you just one stanza from that poem. It's called The Children's Hour by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. From my study, I see in the lamplight, descending the broad hall stairs, grave Aleve and laughing Allegra and Edith with the golden hair. In that picture you see on the right side, I've got golden hair. So I was named for Edith in the Children's Long Hour. And my middle name is Gale because my father's aunt, or his mother's sister's name was Gale Shepherd. So that's where my name came from. The next picture is my younger sister, Mary Lynn. We always teased her and had her crying more times than not. but we love her just the same. Her name is Mary Lynn, and Mary Lynn Gengelbach. Her initials are the same as my father's, MLG, and that's where her name came from. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of see where all of our names came from. I want to talk to you a little bit about the sources that I use. I have been doing genealogy for almost 30 years, and I have collected from family. And the interesting thing about getting information from family is that family does not always remember exactly what it is. So whenever I get a fact from a family member, I verify it with at least one other source. When I first started genealogy, I was told to use 3 sources to verify everything. Sometimes I can and sometimes I cannot. A real good example of that was my father's sister Alice told me that a wife of one of the relatives' last name was Tillery, and I had found research at the Mormon Library that gave her last name as Huffman. And Alice insisted it was Tillery, and I found it documented in the microfilm as being Huffman. And we'll learn later that both of us are correct. Her name is Eliza Tillery Huffman, and I'll tell you her story later on. So you can see that not all family members remember exactly as they should along the way. The second thing that I use as a resource is the United States Census. When I first started genealogy, I had to go to a place in south of Chicago. I live north of Chicago, and I would have to drive a long distance and go to a place where all the United States Census were. When I started preparing this talk, I found all that is now digitized and it's online. And one of the things that I had trouble finding was I had 3 or 4 Senate Youngs, and we're going to talk about Senate Young in a little bit. I found 3 or 4 Senate Youngs, and I had a really, really hard time differentiating between Senate Youngs, where they were from, and their birthdays. But I was able finally, using the census, to find that Senate Young Sr. was indeed in Kentucky. He died, oddly enough, a year before his son, Senate Young, here in Plattsburg, died. So that was very hard to differentiate. Another backup, just a teeny bit, another source of information was this cute little book that has goes all the way back to Ireland, and it was done in 1916, and it's done on the Shepherd family. And we'll talk about the Shepherd family later. And this was a huge source of information for me. The next thing that I found was as a source of information for me is that the State Historical Society of Missouri now has almost any newspaper that was published is digitized, and you can go online, and I was able to search there. The newspapers for Plattsburg are digitized from 1894 to 1944, and I was able to find a lot of information there. And I wanted to read just a short little thing here from the Missouri digitized thing that I found. Found several humorous things in those newspapers. There was a earthquake here in Plattsburg. They had evidently had a huge tornado, maybe 3 or 4 tornadoes going through at the simultaneously. And the last line in the paragraph I read said that basically anybody that had any maladies along the way came out of their house afterwards cured. But the funny one that I found was titled in the Plattsburg Leader, Mad Dog. And it says, the dog was first discovered in the neighborhood of Marion Young, which I'm sure is one of the relatives of ours. And he proceeds on down the road, and then the next time he's heard of, he's a J.H. Young, and that's John Harrison Young, and we are going to talk about John Harrison Young. And they all lived on Reservoir Road, which is still out here in Plattsburg, and we're going to talk about that. But a mad dog was through the neighborhood. They all were in a stir about the mad dog. The next one that I used was, and I found this digitized online, and it's the history of Clinton County. 1881, it's dated, and I found a wealth of information on that, and I simply opened it up and downloaded it all, so it was a wealth of information. There's also been a history of Clinton County that has been published, and that was done in 1977. That has a lot of information in it also. And the last source of information that I have used, and I have kind of intimated that before, was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, and they have everything digitized, and it is absolutely amazing what you can find on there. Every time I start and do a current or an update to my genealogy, I always find surprises, and it's amazing where you never expect a surprise. I remember one time when I first started, I knew that two of my mother's relatives somehow came to different areas, but I could never put them together. And one night I was at the Mormon library doing research with the microfilm, and there on the screen before me was the answer. Both of those families came by covered wagon to Virginia to the same spot, and they were all intermarried, so it was interesting. The surprise this time was I found a William John Young, who was born in 1660, and he was married to a Mary Peake, and their son was John Young, and then after that was Senate Young. So I'm beginning to I can go back a little bit further now. The next one are the names that are associated with Clinton County, and a little history there. So when I get to talking about this, we can kind of put it together. Clinton County was first organized in January 15 of 1833. Concord Township was sort of the central division of the county, and they named the town, it was Concord Township, and they also named the town Concord. In 1834, they changed the name to Springfield, and the reason they did that was that there were two springs here in around Plattsburg. The first of which was Mineral Springs, and it was a group of men, first settlers, went together and had a business. And I believe Springtown Road is probably where that was, and there was a bathhouse and a hotel there. There was also on Smith's Fork or Platte River, Peerless Springs. And shortly after that, they figured out that Springfield was already a name used for a town here in the state. And in 1835, they changed the name to Plattsburg after Plattsburg, Clinton County, New York. And so that's the sort of the history. Now we start with my family, my brother and sister's family. The first one that we're going to talk about is Senate Young. And I found again, as I said, I had trouble differentiating between them, but I found Senate Young Jr. in Kentucky. And then I discovered that the Senate Young that we are so familiar with had a Senate Young III attached to him. And he was born 1789, 1853 died. His son then was John Harrison, 1820 to 1900. Then one of the Youngs married a Gengelbach, and starting in that line of the tree is Johann Christian, born in Germany at 1813, passed in 1897. And then Richard Herman, which now we know and comes in Plattsburg, in 1848, passed in 1910. My grandfather and our grandfather was born in 1878 and passed in 1972. Our father, Morris Lee Gengelbach, born in 1911, passed in 1987. And there are three people that I have not put in line as they should be, but I've separated them because had I separated the Gengelbachs and inserted the Shepherds, the line wouldn't have been as clear cut. So my father's mother married a shepherd, and the first shepherd that I'll talk about is James Shepherd, 1790 to 1872. His son, George A. Shepherd, 1818, passed in 1900. And then the shepherd that lived here in Plattsburg on the 6 Mile Lane was John F. Shepherd, 1849 and 1919 was his passing. Okay, We'll start now with individual people and work our way through that. The first one is Senate III Young, who married Hannah Young, and they came from Montgomery, Kentucky, and they were married there in 1818. And they moved to Clinton County, Missouri, from Bath County, Kentucky, and then they moved to Clay County, Missouri, and then on to Plattsburg in 1836. And the thing that I have learned about these old timers when they would go from one place to the other is that they went in groups, not as just 2 or 3 people. There would be groups of people go that would be family units, and a number of Youngs came this way. And the only one that we are going to talk about is Senate Young and his lineage. They settled in a log cabin about 1 mile north of Plattsburg and built on Reservoir Road. I'm going to show the map. Wait a minute, let me finish that. The map shows the location of the cabin and the family cemetery. 7 children were born to Senate III and Hannah, the second of which is John Harrison Young, and this is the individual that we'll talk about. The map is shown is from the Farm Services Agency, and it shows the grave site and the home site. And I think I want to stop here and tell you this, is that my brother Roland continues to farm the land that Senate Young first started farming on, and he basically operates or owns all the land that we're going to be talking about today. So that the family farms and the acreage has been in the family since basically 1836. So I think that is significant that it has stayed in the family that long. The next person, or the person that was one of the sons that was born, the 4th child born to Senate III and Hannah, was a William V. Young. And he married a Melissa Eaton. Their son was H. Lester Young. And H. Lester was the first rural mail carrier in Clinton County. And one of the things that Lester had to do when he was riding a horse, delivering the mail, was to protect himself. And I'll let Roland come and talk about how he was able to protect himself.
Okay, this is the gun that Lester carried with him when he delivered the mail. He started carrying this gun because he was robbed by local people once in a while. This is the holster. This is the little gun. It's a 32. This is some of the bullets that goes in the gun. We looked up on the internet about the gun, and they said it was a Widowmaker. The little catch on here that it breaks in 2, and the little catch on there don't hold very good. And when you pull the trigger and it fire, it'd swing around and shoot yourself. So they said that the bullets is probably worth more than the gun was.
Lester was a rural mail carrier for 50 years before he retired. Way back when the Senate Young settled in 1836, there were Native Americans or Indians in this general area here, and they were very friendly. And there have been a lot of artifacts found on some of the farms, and Roland will talk about some of the artifacts that were found.
Okay, this Indian reservation was about 200 Indians in it, and they said they were real nice Indians and didn't cause them any trouble. This is some of the artifacts. This is a tomahawk that was found on the farm. This is another tomahawk. This is another one, and this is a little bitty one. I found this over there in the creek about a year and a half ago, and you put it in your right hand like that. I don't know what they used it for, but it's quite obvious it's something that they made. And that's the best I'd go. I don't know what it was for or anything.
A son of Senate Young was John Harrison Young, and he lived on a farm very close to where his father lived. John Harrison married Eliza Tillery in 1848. Eliza Tillery, there's evidence in the Mormon genealogy work that Eliza Tillery was married in Clay County to a Peter Huffman in 1844, prior to her marriage in 1848 to John Harrison. John Harrison and Eliza Tillery farmed land about a mile north of Plattsburg, very near, as I said, to the father. And he also owned land on the east and west sides of the 6 Mile Lane. 6 children were born to John Harrison and Eliza Huffman. Their second child was Sarah Hannah Young, and that's the child we're going to follow. The first child, let's show the picture of Eliza and John Harrison. This is a picture of Eliza and John Harrison outside their home. I do not know the date on it, but you can see he had a long beard, white beard, so he was probably a senior citizen. And you'll notice at the bottom of the picture there are 2 Irish setters. I'm assuming that they were hunters, because that carried on, and my grandfather was a great hunter of ducks and other hunting kinds. Didn't do deer, but ducks, I know he did do that. So Eliza and John Harrison's second child was Sarah Hannah Young, and that's the one we'll follow. Their fourth born child was Fanny Young. Her given name was Melinda Frances Young. Her nickname was Fanny. And she married a gentleman from Plattsburg called Henry Bell McIntyre. And their son was Oscar Odd McIntyre. And he simply went by OOM. And Oscar OOM would go on to become a pioneer syndicated columnist and leading journal. And the picture of Oscar Odd is there. There's a lot of family resemblance. He did his syndication in New York City, and the column was distributed to over 550 newspapers and had over 104 million readers. His parents died young, when he was young, and he moved to live with relatives in Gallipolis, Ohio. And when he passed away, he was brought back to Gallipolis, Ohio. And there is a stone bench close to his headstone that reads, "Beloved of a Nation," and his headstone simply says OOM on it. So that my grandfather, John Christian, was very fond of OOM and spoke fondly of him. And I remember, I only remember my grandfather saying him coming to visit him one time. We're moving on now, and we are going to start with the Gengelbach line. These are the 2 that started the Gengelbach line. They were married, Johann and Johanna. Johann Christian Gengelbach, 1813 to 1897. His wife, Johanna Sophia Martin, was 1823 to 1885, and their marriage was in Germany. There are 2 stories that I have been told. I have not been able to verify either of those. The first one is that he was not the firstborn son, and if you were not the firstborn son in Germany, you had nothing, so you had to find employment and work elsewhere. The second one was that the country of Russia came and took their home away from them, and they had to move. So I do not know, but those are the 2 stories that I've been told. Johann and Johanna moved to Carrollton, Carroll County, Kentucky, and from there they moved to Tell City, Troy Township in Indiana, and they stayed there and did not move on to Missouri after they moved there. Carrollton, I am pretty convinced that they got on the river, which was pretty close to Carrollton in Kentucky, and moved to Tell City, which is right on a river there. And I'm sure, I feel confident that that's how they moved. They had 7 children born to them. Their firstborn was Richard Herman, and that would be my great-great-grandfather. And Richard Herman moved from Tell City, Indiana to Plattsburg, and I do not know the date on that. The 6th child that was born to Johann Christian and Johanna was Edward Gengelbach, and he was a country doctor near Tell City, Indiana, or Huntingsburg, Indiana. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that, and his picture is at the top up there, and there's a lot of family resemblance. The reason I'm bringing this up is that in 1910, my grandfather had decided that he had had enough of farming and would like to become a doctor like his uncle, Ernest Edward. J.C. or John Christian went to visit his uncle, Ernest Edward, and he told him to go back home and be a farmer, which he did. Okay, we'll start talking about Richard Herman Gengelbach, who married Sarah, her name was Sarah, nicknamed Sally Hannah Young. Richard Herman was born in 1848, passed in 1910 in Plattsburg, and Sarah Sally Hannah Young, born 1851 and passed in 1889. They were married in 1875 in Clinton County, and Richard Herman owned a farm, what is now close to Hartell Lake, which is north of Plattsburg. 5 children were born to Richard Herman and Sally. The second son was John Christian, which is our grandfather, and this is the individual that we will begin to talk about. Sally Young passed in 1889, and Richard would continue on the farm and do farm work during the day, and then do the housework at night in an effort to keep his family together. In 1893, Richard married Emma Elizabeth Moore. Do you have the picture of Richard Herman?
Oh, it was finishing.
Okay. Richard Herman married Emma Elizabeth Moore, and I'm told she was from Galway, but I have never verified that. To that union was born 3 children. Richard and Emma had 3 children, and they were Neva, Richard, and Ernest. You're seeing a picture of Richard Herman, and I do not know the date on that picture. The picture now that you're seeing is a picture of the blended family from Sarah Hannah Young and Emma Moore. On the left side is Ernest and Drusilla, and they lived here in Plattsburg. On the back row, left to right, is John Christian, and then Daisy, his wife, and those are our grandparents, and my father is on the far right side, standing in front of a probably 1920s type car. On the front row is Neva, who was the stepdaughter of our stepsister of my grandfather, and Callista, who was the wife of Richard, who is also a step brother of my father's, our grandfather. After Richard Herman comes my grandfather and grandmother, John Christian, or J.C. as he's known around here. And John Christian was born 1878, passed in 1971. Daisy Dare Shepherd, 1880 and 1958. And the home that they eventually established was not more than a mile down the road from where she was born and raised. So that tells you how close the farms are. When they were married in 1908, my grandfather purchased 620 acres from his grandfather, who was John Harrison Young. He also inherited acreage from his grandfather, Sennett Young. And in addition, he purchased other acreage in the area. The home and farm land was about 1 mile north of Plattsburg on the 6-mile lane. I believe that's now Hawaii Highway. 5 children were born to John Christian and Daisy, and the firstborn was my father, and that's the Gengelbach that we will continue to follow. But I have some pictures from John Christian and Daisy. The first one is a watch that he gave, a gold watch and chain that he gave to Daisy, sort of as a will you marry me kind of thing, on June the 1st, 1899. And on the lower right corner is a picture showing the name, and the name says Daisy D. Shepherd. And underneath it says June the 1st, 1899. Their marriage was in March of 1908. And if you look in the middle of the shield, in the middle of the shield is carved a house. And so he was giving it to her to say, will you marry me, I'm assuming. It's a beautiful watch. The next picture is a picture of my grandfather, approximately in 1908. The next one is of my grandmother, Daisy Dare, D-A-R-E, Shepherd. And we think that these are their wedding pictures, and this is Daisy in 1908. John Richard built a house on a knoll north of Plattsburg on the 6 Mile Lane. And that house is still there. It has been changed slightly from its original construction. The house had 10 rooms. It had its own water system. And on the 3rd floor up in the attic was a pump that pumped the water from a spring. And then they had like a big cattle tank up there to store the water. And they had water in the house when they moved in there in 1916, running water. The next picture is 4 of the 5 children that they had. In the back row, left to right, is Alice, and then Morris in the middle, Jessie on the right, and then Lois in the front. The 3 children standing in the back married people from this area and remained in this area all of their life. Lois moved away and then came back. The 5th child, Gordon, hadn't been born at this point in time. The next picture is a picture of the great report card from my father, and the date on it is 1916 to 1917. And I will tell you that he was age 5, and he was in the 1st grade, and most of his markings on here were in the 90s. So his report card probably got good receiving at his home when he got there. The school that was a country school that all the children in the neighborhood went to was called Prayer Cottage School. And on the back row, in a row left to right, is the teacher. And then next to her is my Aunt Alice. Next to her is my father, Morris. And next to him is his cousin, Margaret Shoemaker, who was the daughter of Josephine. So the mother of my father and her mother were the same. And on the far right at the back is Jessie. So there were 3 out of the 5 children out there. Now, Maureen is going to talk to us a little bit about Prayer Cottage School and how that all worked.
Prayer Cottage School was one of many rural schools in Clinton County at one time. It was a mile north of the J.C. Gengelbach farm on 6 Mile Lane. And some of the students walked, but others had to ride horses because they might have to travel 3 miles. I know S.G. and Nair Melton who rode horses because it was about 3 miles to their home. The 15 plus students with one teacher, and she had many jobs. Not only did she teach, she had to sweep the floors, she had to carry in the coals, she had to carry out the ashes, and make sure the school was warm and ready when students got there at 9. Usually the normal hours was 9 to 4, with an hour for lunch. She probably used that well. It was a going concern at Prairie Cottage School until World War II started, and then a lot of the hired hands had to be drafted or else went to work in aircraft plants and things like that. And so they had to close many of the schools, but they were able to keep going for a while, but eventually they closed Prairie Cottage School. Now that almost every country school had an extension club that was affiliated with the school by parents and children who attended that area school. The Prairie Cottage Extension Club was like this when it was formed. It was overseen by a home demonstration agent who was part of the University of Missouri Extension Office. It was her job to take different members of the extension clubs and train them in such as areas as canning, cooking, gardening, and sewing. And then those members that were trained went back to their clubs and taught all those that attended about what they were supposed to learn. And that's how they learned how to cook and sew and can and take care of their gardens. Now, the Prairie Cottage Club was no exception, but I liked to play school, and so I was the oldest, and I got stuck every summer with playing school with all the kids who had to keep out of the house until the meeting was over.
The next picture you're seeing is a hobby horse. The top picture is a hobby horse that was sitting in a wagon. My father is on the left side of the picture, and several of his cousins are seated to the right of him. It was a hobby horse that he received at Christmas between 1913 and 1914. When my grandfather J.C. Gengelbach's house was disassembled, I went in the basement, because usually in the basement there are lots of treasures, and there, laying on the floor in a heap, was pieces of this hobby horse. I'm sorry, the picture turned out kind of dark, but my husband and I took the pieces, reassembled them. My husband redappled it based on the picture that was taken in 1913 and 14. I purchased tack from a store, and it has the hair is replaced with real horsehair for the mane and the tail, and we restored that in approximately 1917. So it's a still functioning hobby horse. The next picture is a picture of my father when he was about 8.5 or 9 years old in front of his parents' house. And he has a really neat wagon with a barrel on it, and he's got his good straw hat to protect himself. The next picture is a picture of three of John Christian's children. Morris is at the back, Alice to the left, and Jessie to the right. And this picture was approximately 1927. So my father would have been about 16 years of age at that point in time. The next picture is a car that was purchased in 1928. It's a 1928 Ford. And this Ford has a history and some interesting stories. It cost him about $500, and the car was purchased so that the children of John Christian and Daisy could be transported to town to go to high school. Morris and Alice, his sister, milked cows and sold the cream in order to purchase this car. My father was kind of mischievous, and I think maybe that's where I got my mischievousness. He told me of a switch he had on the inside of this car, and he would come to town, and of course he left his sister in the dust and didn't get to drive the car very often. But my father would come to town, agitate the police a little bit, and he would get them to chasing him, and he would run himself into an alley real quick, turn the switch that he had hooked up in the car and turn the car and the lights off, and the police would go by and they would start in again. So this is the car that they had in 1928. The next thing that I have is a little a page from the bank book that Morris used to make his deposits. This page is from 1929, which is about a year after he purchased the car. And if you can remember, when you went to the bank, you always had to carry your little bank book with you. And when you gave it to the teller would put the date and put who the money was coming from and enter the information in there. One of the biggest ones on this page is $39.98, and the lowest one on this page is $4.25. So that was discontinued. And when I was preparing this talk, I thought about how times have changed. At Christmas, I sent my children Christmas gifts electronically, so I didn't use a card or a check or anything. And it shows you how different the banking system has changed. The next picture are the 5 children of John Christian and Daisy. And this picture was taken about 1934. Morse is in the back, as is Gordon, his younger brother. In the front is Jesse, in the middle is Alice, and on the right is Lois. And those are the 5 children. And what I've tried to do is to begin kind of showing them as they get older through the years. The next picture shows, taken in 1969, and JC was having his 93rd birthday. Back row is Gordon on the left, Alice in the middle, my father, Morse, on the right. Front row is Jesse on the left, John Christian in the middle at 91 years of age, and Lois on the right side. The next one was taken of the 5 children were taken in 1986. Again, Morse in the back row, Gordon to his right, in front row Jesse, middle was Lois, and Alice was on the right. This is the last picture that they would have together because our father would pass away in 1987. This is a picture of John Christian, taken about 1940. He was always bald, and I always remember my father with a hat on, so that was kind of unusual to see him this way, 1940. Daisy is the next one in 1940, and this is how I always remember my grandmother looking. She was thin and tall, probably 6 feet at least, and she did a lot of handwork along through the years. The next one is a bunch of the grandchildren of John Christian, taken in about 1950. And on the back row on the left is Maureen and her husband Billy. And next to him is my younger sister Mary. Roland's got his head bent down and he's trying to keep Jean Paul, who was Gordon's youngest child, from crying because he's having a fit in the picture. And I'm to the right of Roland in that picture. And also you will see some Fulkersons in there and some of Gordon's other children there. The next thing I'd like to talk about is that back many years ago, when you got a hole in your sock, you would pick up this little darning egg and you would slip the sock over the end and you would take thread and patch the hole. And this is called a darning sock. The next thing I would like to show you is that I told you that my grandmother did a lot of handwork. This is her tatting shuttle. You can see the string is extremely thin. And she did a lot of tatting in the work. This is a sterling silver tatting shuttle. And we see a handkerchief that has got tatting around the edge of it. And then there also is a doily that she would have made with the tatting.
My grandmother spent most afternoons doing tatting or embroidery, and in the summertime she went to the basement. She always put on a clean dress, usually white, according to records, and she would tat. Now that tatting is very, very fine, and so it had directions to make the doily come out just exactly like it was, and so upside down. And so I would sit by the hour and tell her what the directions said. I was never quite sure whether that was her way of keeping me quiet and sitting or whether I was really helping her, because I wasn't there all the time and she managed to tat when I wasn't around. Something tells me that that was what Grandma was up to. She was keeping me busy and out of the way.
One of the things that I found in my grandmother's house were 2 little pairs of scissors, which are absolutely beautiful. This one is sterling silver and it has little flowers on it. Could likely be daisies. And I'm sure she used that embroidery when she was doing embroidery or tatting. The other little pair of scissors that I found is in the shape of a swan, and you can see that the bill of the bird are the parts of the scissors. There's evidence that this was gold at the beginning, but isn't that a unique, interesting pair of scissors? When we would go visit our grandparents, there was not much playing going on, but my grandfather had a dog, a little black stuffed dog, and he also had and his name was Scotty. He had one other toy for us to play with, and Roland's going to talk about that toy.
Okay, this is a golden goose, and everybody that knew anything about my granddad knew that we had the golden goose. Every time he did this, you put marbles in him and he would lay an egg.
The next picture shown on the stand is a daisy churn. And this is a churn that I took from John Daisy and Daisy's house. And it was used fairly regularly to make butter. And on the middle part of the stand in the front is a little daisy that's impressioned in the metal there. So it was kind of unique that it was a daisy. It was a daisy churn for a daisy. The next picture is a chest of drawers that was given to John and Daisy at their marriage, and Maureen will talk to us about that.
This chest of drawers that you see is solid walnut, and I was always told that it was given to my grandparents, Daisy and John, at their wedding in 1908. It was made locally, and it was made of walnut, and it had casters. And it was solid walnut, which meant it is heavier than you know what. In fact, the girl that cleans for me told me, she had said, I don't move it very often, but I keep it and I use it every day to keep my sweaters and some of my clothing in. But the knobs are crystal in the picture, but you can tell they are not the original knobs. Now, I've never known it to be anything but crystal, but you can tell there was some other kinds of knobs.
The next picture that you see is a Civil War era horsehair chair that I found in my grandfather's and grandmother's house when their house was being disassembled. The fabric on the chair is horsehair, and I have an individual that does restoration for me where I live in Illinois, and he was able to purchase a real horsehair. And at the bottom of this picture, it says, I found this description of how horsehair is made. The long coarse hairs growing on the manes and tails of live horses is used in the weft, and cotton and silk are used in the warp of a loom to weave a horsehair fabric. And they're usually about 23 to 27 inches wide. So the seat and the back on this chair has been refurbished, restored, and it's real horsehair. Just as a little side note to kind of date this particular chair, I have seen almost an identical chair to this in Abraham Lincoln's home in Springfield, Illinois.
Okay, these are wooden bits, and they were used in the construction of barns. The beams were hooked together with wooden pegs. You take the beam and two beams and you stick it together and you bore the hole down through them and you stick a wooden peg in the hole, and that's how the barns was constructed because they did not have nails at that time. Now then, we're going to go right on to John Christian Gengelbach's farming information. Crops were a minor form of income back when my grandfather, John C. Gengelbach, began farming in the community. He had a few cows and sold registered Duroc hogs and gilts. My father, Morris Gengelbach, would be angry when he would work with the hogs because Grandpa would say, stop the red one, but they were all red.
It's hard for us to go back and find out what type of farming that our ancestors did here around in Plattsburg, but I did see when I was researching the old copies of the Plattsburg Leader online that they talked about a Charles Young taking cattle to Chicago, and they sold for $12.75, and I'm figuring that's what one cow or calf or steer made. The next family member we're going to talk about are our parents, Morris Lee Gengelbach, who was born in 1911 and passed in 1987. His wife, Alice Irene Rowland, born 1910 and passed 2005. They were married in 1935 here in Plattsburg, Clinton County, and settled on a farm about 3 miles north and west of Plattsburg on Route K, and that's where all of our homes were throughout the years. The original farm that they started with was 160 acres that was given to them at marriage by the cousin of Alice Irene Rowland, who was Carl Richard Jenkins and Dixie Lincoln Stoudemore Jenkins. Later, an additional 80 acres was purchased from Carl and Dixie, making a total of 240 acres on the home place. In 1945, 240 acres were purchased from Harold Thompson. In addition to these acres, Morse farmed additional acreage. 4 children were born to Morris and Alice. Their firstborn child was Alice Maureen Gengelbach Bodenhausen, and she married Frederick William Bodenhausen. They have 3 children, Lee William, Anne Irene, and Eric Charles. Roland Lee Gengelbach married Mary Lou Pendleton, and they have 3 children, Kimberly Ann, David Lee, and Randy Jean. Edith Gail Gengelbach Fessler married Raymond Roy, and they have 2 children, Mark Elliott and John Roderick. Mary Lynn Gengelbach, the youngest, married Charlie Evans, and they have 2 children, Ryan George and Matthew Lee. And you can begin to see my father's name crop up in a lot of the grandchildren's name. The next picture we have is my father taken in his christening gown in 1911, and he was about 2 months of age when this picture was taken. I remember hearing them say that he was born on November the 17th, and that his first outing was Thanksgiving to a big family dinner that same year. The next picture is an interesting picture of 2 cousins. The one on the left is Morris dressed as a lady with his fancy hat on, and the one on the right is his cousin Margaret Shoemaker. They are first cousins. Their mothers are sisters, and this picture was taken in about 1925. The next picture is my father in a dapper cream-colored suit in front of a fancy car, taken in about 1928. And I showed this because it showed the car about that time period, and a very dapper man. The next picture is a picture of my father. He was camping. As you can see, he has one leg of his pajamas rolled up, and he has a pair of boots or something in his hand, and he's standing in front of a car. This picture was taken when my father and his friend, Emmett Fulkerson, went on a trip south. And this was taken in 1932, and they were allowed to go on this trip, this expedition, as long as they took the younger son of the younger brother of Morris, who was Gordon. Gordon was 12 years of age, Emmett was 23, and Morris was 21, and Gordon was their chaperone, so they wouldn't get in trouble. About this same time, I have a sterling silver knife that belonged to my father. It has his initials on it, MLG, and at this point in time, men usually wore a vest, and in one pocket they would put a knife or a similar object, and the other end they would hook a watch to that, and that would be inside their vest. My mother's father was killed in a mining accident, and she was left a widow. And because she could not care for all the children, my mother, who is on the left side with her sister, my mother was about 6 years of age. Her younger sister, Laura, was about 18 months, and her other sister, Evelyn, was about 9 years of age. And soon after this time, my mother came to live with her cousin, who was Carl Richard Jenkins, here in Plattsburg, and she lived here for the rest of her life. The next picture is a picture of my mother in about 1933, and this is her graduation picture from Lindenwood College in St. Louis, Missouri. This was taken in 1933. Soon in 1935, my mother married my father, and this is her hope chest, And in that, I have that in my home, and I have on the side of that hope chest a wedding ring quilt that she received and kept in her hope chest. The next picture is a picture of my father outside where we were born and raised on Route K here in Plattsburg, or outside of Plattsburg. He's driving a wooden horse, or wooden wagon, and he has his two mules, Pete and Nellie, and there's a wooden seat at the front of the wagon he's in, and I have an arrow indicating that the dog Queen was sitting on the seat, and you saw another Queen earlier that Roland was feeding. The bottom picture on this page is the first tractor that Morse got, and it was in 1940. It was a Farmall H. It was a sin to drive a John Deere around Morse. And Roland tells me that the horsepower of this tractor was 35 horsepower. And we'll find a different size horsepower on another tractor soon down the road. Morse, as you know, was a farmer, and he raised different crops. And Roland will talk to us about some things about his farming.
Those days, with the horse and wagon, they what they call snapping it. They grab a hold of the stalk, take the ear, and jerk it off. And that's how they picked the corn. And it had the shucks still on it. Today, this shucker, what they had, they'd grab a hold of the shuck like that, and that's what they used to pull the shuck off with.
Honey and molasses were used as a sweetener during World War II because sugar was only used for canning. And so we had to go and get honey from a honey farm down by Edgerton, and we would load up, I don't know, as many as 4 or 5-gallon cans of honey and take it back home and store it in the basement where it was cool. Then also, we used molasses in cooking. It was pretty strong to put on cereal and things, but Mother used it in cooking. And it came from a farm north of us with a farmer who grew sorghum, cooked it down, and it made a syrup, and that's what molasses was made from. Now, also about that time, my Aunt Lois Gengelbach lived in Philadelphia, and she had more sugar coupons than she could use, so because everybody got the same thing throughout the United States. So she would send her sugar coupons and her neighbors' coupons to Grandma Gengelbach, and then she would ship her fresh eggs in cartons of maybe 6-8 dozen at a time, and Lois would share them with her neighbors, and that way Grandma would get extra sugar coupons, and she'd share them with her family.
At this same time, my dad was doing a lot of work for other people in his shop, and he wanted to buy a welder. And he couldn't buy a welder because he had to use coupons to do it. So several of his neighbors went together and gave him some of their coupons so he could go buy this welder, and then he agreed to do work for them for nothing for giving him his coupons. Also, my dad built probably one of the very first wind generators. And on the south side of our house, he stuck a pipe way up in the air. He took a generator off of a Model A car, put an airplane propeller on it, and put a little bitty tail wheel on it, kind of like a windmill. And then he ran a cable down into the basement where there was great big batteries. And we were some of the very first ones that had electricity, but it was DC electricity, so we had a DC refrigerator, and we had light bulbs, a few light bulbs that would work in the house.
And my mother would make cakes occasionally as for a special occasion. And the recipes that are shown there are 2 recipes. One is for honey chocolate cake, and the other one at the bottom of the page is for honey applesauce cake. The equivalent substitution was, for 1 cup of sugar, you used about 3/4 to a cup of honey, depending upon how sweet that you wanted it. In 1945, My father had applied for a patent for an invention he did on his Farmall H tractor that we talked about earlier. The name of the patent, well, he submitted it in 1945 and received approval for it in 1949. The topic of the patent was power scoop or shovel for tractors. The first part of the paragraph of this patent reads, "This present invention relates to material handling equipment with particular reference to power shovel or scoop apparatus designed to be mounted for operation upon regular or conventional forms of farm tractors." And there was a blade on the front of it, and there was a scoop kind of patterned after the old Fresno scoops on the back of it. And it was never really put into production, but it is a registered patent. During that period of time, we also, the children of Morris and Alice, went to country school. And the name of the school was Mount Hope. The picture that is shown there is from 1948 to 1949. And then there are a number of children from the same family. Maureen, Roland, and I are in this picture. And I'll have her tell you a little bit about Mount Hope and what went on in the school.
This is the bell from Mount Hope School. Sorry, probably split your ears. It originally had a wooden handle, but it broke, and because my father could adapt anything, he took some mother's wooden thread that's used for spools that's used for sewing and made a handle for it. And I take it on occasion to church when people won't be quiet so I can do my bit, and Roland always yells at me. I don't do it anymore. Now, Mount Hope School was open longer than some of the other schools. They were able to maintain people in it, and we had almost a different teacher every year. Daddy was president of the school board, and so that's how I got the bell. Now, for a long time, there was only two girls. Nadine, Malin, and I were at the bottom on the row over there, and we wore pants, mainly because it was cold, and then also because we wanted to play outside with the boys, because there was only two girls, there wasn't much to do. Now, the county superintendent of schools was Straussy Myers. Straussy didn't think a girl should ever be seen in anything but a skirt. So we never knew when she was going to come to visit. So we would watch for her, because hidden away in one of the empty desks was chicken feed sack skirts. And Nadine and I'd run, slip them on, and then roll our pant legs up and sit down in the seat and be ready when she came in. They had to have been wrinkled, and I'm sure she knew what was going on, but she never said a word. Now, school was, the teacher, like I said, they had taught school, they keep the building clean, they made sure the fires were going, and they taught every grade 1 through 4. But when it came to upper grades, they taught even school children, skipped and back and forth. Odd school birthday children went straight through. Now, I was born in 36, so when I got to 5th grade, or when I got through 4th grade, I went to 6th grade. Then I went back to 5th grade. Then I went back to 8th grade. But before I could go to 7th grade, they closed Mount Hope School, and all the schools, country schools in Clinton County, went to Gower, Lathrop, or Plattsburg. And so they plopped us into 7th grade, Nadine Mallon and Johnny Mallon and I, because we were all in the 7th. And we never had 8th grade math. Now, I love math, and I'm pretty good at it. But every day we had a test, up through high school and college. If it had to do with like formulas like 1/2 base times height, I'd have to go back and remember it and memorize it, because I never learned it when I was in 8th grade. Like, that was when they taught it then. Now they teach it like in 4th, 5th grade, but back then it was 8th grade. Now, we had recess and at noon and morning and afternoon, and we would play baseball. I don't remember football, we played baseball. and we would have a ball and bat. But the ball would die on us, fall apart, and the bats would get broken. So we'd use a stick and a chalkboard eraser. I don't know how the teacher ever had enough erasers because we used them for many balls. We would use that, and then we'd play Annie over the coal shed. Half of us get on one side of the coal shed and the other, and then we'd throw it across and see who could catch the most. And that was a fun project. School building was too tall, so we couldn't do that over the school. Now, at the end of the school year, they had what they called Achievement Day, and the upper grades had to go and take a test to make sure that you learned everything. And among the things that we had to learn was agriculture. And we had a textbook that told us boys and girls took the same classes for agriculture. And we used that textbook, and then we also had bulletins from the University of Missouri that pertained to crops and cattle and hogs, and sheep too for some. But when we had that achievement day, we'd work on the tests in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we'd have a talent show. Very interesting. Nadine and I did one kind called I'm a Little Teapot, Short and Stout. Very, very good. Can't believe they sat there and listened to that. But no, there was no extension club connected with Mount Hope School, but they were social events through the school. We always had a wiener roast in the fall. We always had a play or some kind of a program for Christmas. And then in the spring, we would have a play or a show. But school didn't go till May back then. School was out in April, so the boys could help with farming. We did start right after Labor Day. We went from school from 9 to 4. But come Labor Day, we went from school from 9 to 4. But come middle of April, we were out of there because the boys had to help on the farm. Very, very good. Can't believe they sat there and listened to that. But no, there was no extension club connected with Mount Hope School, but they were social events through the school. We always had a wiener roast in the fall. We always had a play or some kind of a program for Christmas. Spring, we would have a play or a show, but school didn't go till May back then. School was out in April, so the boys could farming. We did start right after Labor Day. We went from school from 9 to 4. But come middle of Labor Day, we went from school from 9 to 4. But come middle of Stout. Very, very good. Can't believe they sat there and listened to that. But no, there was no extension club connected with Mount Hope School, but they were social events through the school. We always had a wiener roast in the fall. We always had a play or some kind of a program for Christmas. And then in the spring, we would have a play or a show. But school didn't go till May back then. School was out in April, so the boys could farming. We did start right after Labor Day. We went from school from 9 to 4. But come middle of Labor Day, we went from school from 9 to 4. But come middle of Stout. Very, very good. Can't believe they sat there and listened to that. But no, there was no extension club connected with Mount Hope School, but they were social events through the school. We always had a
1957. I remembered later after I did the caption for this is that she called it the Bruder House. The top picture on the left side are the little chickens underneath the heat lamps that she had for them. The bedding for the chickens was vermiculite. When I did research on that, found that the vermiculite could soak up 3 to 4 times its volume in water, so she didn't have to change their bedding very frequently. Each spring, we would load ourselves in the car and come to the Young Hatchery, which is on the south side of Plattsburg, and my mother would pick up 100 chickens, and those would then be raised until they were about 1.5 to 2 pounds, and then she would prepare them for the the locker in town that we stored them in. On the right side is a picture of one of the waters that she used to use for the chickens, and I have that at my house now. The top portion would have been a half-gallon, in this instance would have been a half-gallon mason jar, and the base of it was, this is all glass, and the base of it was a sort of looked like a thing that you would squeeze a lemon on, but there was an opening on the side, and it would regulate and keep water in the bottom of that little pan at all times.
Because my mother raised 100 chickens each year for food and eggs, lots of chicken feed was bought. And the chicken feed back then had printed sacks. And my mother would buy 2 or 3 of the 25 or 30 pound sacks of feed that were matching prints so that she could use them for a skirt or a dress for us when we were small. Now they had to be shrunk because they were very, very cheap and plump. And one day she forgot to shrink the dress, and she made it for me. And the first time she washed it, why, I came downstairs and the pockets were clear up here instead of way down at the bottom of the hem. And Daddy called me High Pockets. And after that, that was always my name. Now, moving on to the garden, Mother had a huge garden. There were vegetables and grapes, and she loved gardening. And so I would help in the house, and I would fix, about the only thing I knew to cook was Spanish rice, 3 pounds of hamburger, and a quart of tomatoes, and 2 cups of rice. And Roland called it panty rice, and the kids got so they, Edith and Roland would groan whenever I cooked, because it was always panty rice. But Mother loved gardening, and she would, one of the things she did was she made sweet pickles. Sweet pickles making was not easy. First of all, you had to put them in a big granite, that wasn't granite, but that's what they call them, a 5-gallon jar with layers of salt and water, and put something heavy over the top of it. And then after a few days, then we'd drain that off, and then we'd start using sugar water, and that had to be drained off every day for 14 days to make 14 days sweet pickles. It was not too much fun. And then later on, after the pickle situation, why, before home freezers were made, why, there was a locker plant in town. And Mother would freeze corn and peas and a few other vegetables, and then we'd have hogs and cattle butchered, and we'd store them in the locker. But Mother and I and nobody else in our family ever liked green beans frozen, so there was never any green beans in the locker.
Along with, that kind of goes along with my mother's garden, is the fact that my father had a sprayer on his Farmall tractor that he loved to use to spray weeds. Unfortunately, when sometimes he would get a little too close to my mother's garden, and the 2,4-D would make the plants in the garden kind of hang over and say maybe you got a little too close. That was always a bone of contention between the two of them, and they never did resolve that as long as he used the 2,4-D.
A need for a nursing home in the community was a concern of many citizens in Plattsburg. In 1968, Oak Ridge became a reality of the first board members. Jim Woodward, which was a brother-in-law of my dad, Bob King, president of the bank at that time, Mary Ellen Dedman, a school teacher, Robert Frost, a lawyer, Dr. Larry Ozenberger, a medical doctor, R. Melton Hoover, a farmer, Mrs. Dan O'Connor was a farmer's wife, and she was the nurse, and my dad, Morris Gengelbach, and Francis Hales. My father was also very active in the community, serving in many different ways. He was an active board member of the American Bank, and known as the U.S. Bank now. He served for 24 years as a director from 1963 to 1987. And here's a plaque that they give him at that time for serving that many years at the bank. He He also was raised in the First Christian Church in Plattsburg and became a member of the First Presbyterian Church upon marrying my mother. He served many capacities such as deacon, elder, session member, but his greatest joy was serving as Sunday school superintendent. He was also a member of the Farm Bureau and served on the board for many years.
I would now like to share with you a jar that my mother gave to me, and it was used for what they call potted meat. I have a larger jar that I did not transport with me that is 6 inches tall. This jar began to be used in the 1700s and through 1800s, and I do not know the origin, but it was used for storage of meat. What they would do was cook the meat, and then they would put it hot in the jars and pack it in tight so that there was no air, and then they would put a layer of fat on the top of it, which would seal it and make the bacteria not be able to get into it to spoil the meat. And then they would usually harvest or butcher the hog or whatever it is in the late fall, store it in these potted meat jars, and then put it in the caves where it would stay cool, or basements where it would stay cool for several months or throughout the winter. This is a picture of a chair that I found when we were disassembling the house of Carl and Dixie Jenkins. It's a rope seat chair, and the restoration was done by myself with a fellow that I use up in Chicago. During the restoration, the man that was working on it was able to see on the rungs where the seat are, where the rope had made impressions in the wood, so he knew what size the rope should be. He then went and did a research on it because he didn't know how to do this. He then went and did research and found how to do this rope chair in a Boy Scout manual, and he reconstructed it for myself. I thought it was old and about the Civil War era when I had it in my home. But this past summer, I was with my granddaughter in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and one day when we were out on the battlefield, there was a medical tent, and in it, of course, was all period furniture, and there sat a rope chair just like this. So it is a Civil War era. The children of Morris and Alice, there were 4 children. The oldest was Alice Maureen Gengelbach, who was married to Frederick William Bodenhausen. This family picture was taken in 1970. Anne Irene, their child on the left, was born in 1963. Eric Charles in the middle, 1968. And Lee William was born in 1961. Maureen now lives in Plattsburg. Roland is the second child born to Morris and Alice, and here's their family picture. David on the left, who was born in 1961, then Mary Lou, then Randy in front, who was born in 1967, Roland in the back, and Kimberly Ann, who is 1951. Was born in, 1959. All 3 of their children currently reside in town, Plattsburg here, and Roland will talk about 2 of them later on, or 1 of them later on. The next picture is my family, my husband Raymond, myself, and my 2 sons. John is on the left. He was born in 1968, and Mark is on the right, and he was born in 1965. The last child born to Morris and Alice was Mary. This is her family picture taken in about 1981. Her husband Charlie is on the left, then her son Ryan, who was born in 1969, then Mary in the back, and Matt is in front, and he was born in 1992. 1972. I have these people younger than they really are. The picture we have now is of a John Deere tractor, and we all know that Morris would probably turn over in his grave if he knew that Roland was driving a John Deere instead of a farmhaul. But needless to say, Roland is now driving a John Deere tractor, model 9470. And notice that the horsepower is 470, and we talked about Farmall H tractor, and if you remember that had 35 horsepower. So you can see how the tractor sizes have changed just since the 1940s. This picture is of Roland standing on the right, his son Randy in the middle, and his grandson on the left. This family business, it says on the bottom, currently farms about 3,000 acres of corn and soybeans. 1,500 acres of grass are devoted to raising 300 cows with calves. I would like for Roland to come now and talk to you a bit about his farming.
After finishing high school, I went to 1 year of college in Maryville to become an architect or mechanical engineer, but this was not my deal. After getting married, I was given a farm of 240 acres by my mother's grandparents, Carl and Dixie Jenkins. When I began farming on my own in the 60s, I had 25 cows and fed about 5,000 hogs a year. They were all in confinement. I also continued with the row crops of about 500 acres of both corn and soybeans at that time. Not all was for me. I did quite a bit of planting and combining and custom work for other farmers in the area. I like to design and build different equipment I designed in my hog operation, I designed a milk feeder for baby pigs. Okay, when a sow has 14 or 15 baby pigs and she only has 12 teats for the pigs to suck on, then the others are going to die. So I come up with the idea we had to save these pigs. So on this feeder, I went with an engineering company that helped me design this milk feeder, and it's designed after a chocolate and hot chocolate and coffee vending machine. You put the powdered milk for the pigs in the thing, and it blends it in with hot water and stirs it up and drops it down. And they got fed every 10 minutes. And on the 9th minute for the next feeding, the pigs would stand around a second. When that thing started buzzing, they hit it. And this was a plaque that I was given by chore time for designing that piece of equipment for them. I also like to do a lot of other designing and stuff like this. And in our cattle operation, I built this cattle chute. It's got a hydraulic squeeze cattle chute on the end of it and a portable alleyway that hydraulically lets down and raises up. This tongue on the end of it is off of a swing tongue mower conditioner. So we just made everything, and it swings out of the way hydraulically when you get to where you're starting working the cattle. Over 1,000 acres of our farm have been terraced at this time. My son David and Randy helped with the hog operation when we sold hogs. And in 1998, we sold our last fat hogs because we just couldn't afford to keep on doing it because the big boys that was raising hogs just run us clear out of business. We didn't have no place to sell them. So at that time, Randy and my grandson Joshua kept on helping with the farming operation, and we started getting bigger with the cow and calf operation. Today we have 300 head of cows with calves, no hogs, and last year we planted over 3,000 acres of corn and soybeans. The cattle operation has become a lot more sophisticated. Instead of using bulls, we breed artificially inseminating. And about 70% of these cows out of the 100% get artificially bred, and the rest of them have to be bred with a clean-up bull. The farming operation is controlled by GPS on our tractors and combine. The tractor and combine program plants and combines without driving. When I first started farming, I used a 6-row 30-inch planter. Today we use a 24-row 30-inch 60-foot wide planter. That is just a few of the difference in how this farming has changed. Oh, I guess I should remind you, now also the GPS keeps track of cost, yield, in the field, and we can set the tractor to combine upon virtually everything that does itself on the GPS.
To the shepherds, which are the last groups of people that we will talk about. The James Shepherd and his wife Mary were married in Ireland, and they immigrated to Harlem Springs, Carroll County, Ohio in 1815. They didn't move from Harlem Springs in their lifetime. But in this little book that was written in 1916 by their daughter, Alice King, there's a description of the cabin that they lived in for the first few years that they were there. A cabin was built in 1817. This is a quote from the book. A cabin was built in 1817. The cabin had puncheon floors, round log walls, chinked with chips and clay mortar. The huge outside chimney was built of stones and mortar, and the clapboard roof was fastened on with notched logs, knees, and wooden pins. The door with this latch string and one small paper-covered window completed the cabin. The last sentence says there was no metal in this cabin. 14 children were born to James and Mary. The second of their children was George Alexander Shepherd, and that is the one that we will follow. George Alexander Shepherd was born in 1818 and passed in 1900. Letitia Atwell, his wife, was born in 1818 and passed in 1901. I discovered in the research for this talk that they were born about 2 counties apart in Kentucky. Their marriage was in 1844 in Carroll County, Ohio, and then shortly after their marriage, they moved to Washington County, Ohio. Later, they returned to Carroll County and purchased a farm there. In 1861, this family moved to Clinton County, Missouri. 8 children were born to Letitia and George. Their second son was John F. Shepherd. Mary Shepherd was the first child of George Alexander Shepherd and Letitia Atwell. She completed a sampler, as you can see, and she completed that in March of 1866, and she died a short time later in November of that same year. It's kind of hard to figure out what it says, but let me read it to you. It was done in 1866, so the Civil War was uppermost in a lot of people's minds. I have it in my home, and it is framed in a handmade walnut frame. The text of it is, "Unfold thy hues, O banner bright, that every star be seen. Thy red shall float o'er battlefield." And you notice, and you can't, it's kind of hard to see, but the D of field is above that line because she ran out of space to put it there. The next line says, "To cheer the true and brave. And brightly glow, why drooping low," low is on the line below, "above the warrior's grave, so when the weary soldier falls in battle for the free, may his last thoughts be of his God beneath the folds of thee." Sampler from 1866. I get my centuries mixed up, don't I? One of the things that I forgot to tell you about was a linen towel or a linen tablecloth that was made by James Shepherd, who lived in Pennsylvania. This is a linen towel that was made for the family dining room table. The flax was grown on the farm of that family. It was brought in and carded and then woven into this pattern. It's difficult for you to see, but there is a very distinct pattern here, like little diamonds side by side, and the thread had to have been extremely fine. This Alice Keene, who wrote that history book, cut it down into towels and gave it to some of the family members. My Aunt Alice Gengelbach Woodward gave it to me, and it has tatting on the edge of the towel, and that was done by the Shepherds that lived in Pennsylvania. Next family member is John F. Shepherd, and this is the last of the Shepherds that we'll talk about. John F. Shepherd built a home home on 6 Mile Lane, just about a mile from where my grandparents used to live. John Shepherd, 1849, passed in 1919. Sarah Elizabeth Thomas was born 1848 and passed in 1903. They married in Plattsburg, Clinton County in 1873. I found in the Plattsburg Leader that they operated the O'Connor Farm, which was 320 acres, which is where they lived, but I could not verify that. The article in the Plattsburg Leader at that time also said Mr. S. is among the largest stock raisers in the country. The home and farm, was, as I said, was located about a mile north of Plattsburg. They had 4 children, the third of which was Daisy Dare, who is my grandmother.
That you're seeing is a quilt chest, and it was not made of cedar. And it came to Daisy Shepherd by her ancestors who brought it in a covered wagon from Ohio. Her aunt, they called House of Cameron, kept it as a souvenir and used it, and then gave it to my grandmother, and then she in turn gave it to me. I didn't realize how important it was, and I used my kids' games and toys in it till I realized how important it was. Now it's kept for quilts in my home.
This is my picture of my grandfather, John F. Shepherd. He was quite tall. The caption on the back, he was heading off toward Colorado again. I'm not sure of the date of this, but the caption on the back says, he wouldn't take a trunk. His sister lived in Colorado when John was off to see her. It's kind of hard to discern, but there are 4 suitcases there he carried instead of taking the trunk. The next picture shows how tall he was, John F. was, as his arms extended, and there are 2 people standing underneath those arms. The last picture I'm going to show you is of some of the children of John F. Shepherd. In the back row is my grandmother Daisy. In the middle was her sister Josephine, who married Shoemaker. And on the far right at the back is her sister Gail, who never married and stayed in the home and took care of her father after her mother passed away. In the middle row is is Lois, then Jessie, then Alice, siblings. And Margaret is on the end there, also a cousin. In the front row is Gordon at the far left, and then Morse sitting in the middle. I want you to know that we have really enjoyed making this presentation available to you, and I hope it gives you insight not only into our family members, but the way they lived, how they farmed, and how they took care of their families. Thank you for enjoying it. Thank you.